So great to be with you here today.
Hey, Brian. Absolute pleasure. Welcome. Hey.
Yeah, I met you, as you remember, out at Low Carb Break this year, which is a great
Yeah.
conference, and made a lot of great connections out there. And I love
Mm,
that conference because it's just, it's sort of no fluff, a lot of science, good old school presentations,
mm,
and then lots of time to really put our minds together and talk about things like diabetes and obesity and low carb
mm.
diets and all these problems that we're trying to solve. So great to meet you out there.
Yeah. No, Jeff and Rod are great guys. So yeah, they're
Mhm.
fantastic to hang out with. They do a great conference. So, yeah.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. So I would love to ask you how you got into this line of work, sort of what your background is, and if you have a
Yeah.
personal story and kind of how you started down this path.
Yeah. Well, came across diabetes. I married my wife Monica about 18 years ago, and well, I met her about 18 years ago, and she's got type 1 diabetes, and I suppose it then started the ball rolling from there. Going the adventure, and then she was, following standard type of advice, and then we went and started to think about having children, and we found a really good GP who had some really good techniques about managing it. And I got completely fascinated in it at that point, and then going through pregnancies and risks of pregnancies and trying to manage diabetes and the changes in insulin resistance through pregnancies. And by day, I'm an engineer, so I applied my engineering systematized sort of mind to this problem of diabetes and trying to keep her blood sugars at whatever optimum was meant to be, and just continually changing the dose with that, I suppose, that fear in my head of, we've got to manage this pregnancies because of the risks, et cetera, et cetera. So I was quite motivated back then, but it wasn't till maybe 5 years ago or so until, I found Rob Wolf, and then I found the Low Carb Down Under guys, and then I stumbled across Type 1 Grit, and, I fell into a rabbit hole of fascination there. And then maybe, 3 years ago now, I stumbled across the idea of the insulin index. Some testing was done a while ago in 1987, which was on 25 foods, which was completely confusing to understand our insulin response to food. And then maybe 3 years ago, a thesis came out from the University of Sydney that quantified about 100 different foods and their insulin response and glucose response. And I thought, well, maybe if we could crunch this data a little better, we could find how I can better manage Monica's diabetes, particularly her insulin requirements to manage not just carbohydrates, but also fiber and also protein. So I started crunching the numbers and found a fairly interesting relationship between carbohydrates minus fiber plus about half the protein predicts the short-term insulin response to food. So that's really exciting for type 1s because it enables you to accurately predict the insulin demand that you have to dose. And then I suppose for type 2s and the like, it helps you to prioritize foods that enables you to rank your choices of foods to have the lowest insulin response. So if your pancreas isn't keeping up, it's a really good idea. So yeah, and then I started blogging about that, just met a lot of amazing people online and through social media, and it's just been a passion, and applying my engineering approach to nutrition and diabetes has been just a fascinating journey over the last 3 years. So yeah, that's where it
great.
started. And, yeah.
Engineers oftentimes bring a lot of the best concepts to diabetes.
Yeah,
It
it's
seems
just
like
a new
because
angle, I think, to say,
yeah, it
well,
is.
here's a system problem. It's not, let's look for correlations or, population analysis.
Well,
It's like, okay,
I'd love to talk more
what are the
about them.
levers that
Yeah.
move? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, right. What are the levers that can
Yeah,
make the biggest difference to move?
definitely.
And
Definitely.
you talked about your wife with type 1
Mm,
and incredible value there with being able to figure out insulin dosing, because that's a constant problem, especially for people who are trying to follow the standard, conventional diet, which I know obviously you don't recommend for good
mm,
reasons, but trying to dose, a bolus insulin in
yep.
those situations becomes nearly impossible.
Yeah.
But I think, one of the things when I saw you speak and I stumbled upon this concept that you created and formula, one of the things that got me so excited about it was an extension of kind of how you started to think about it, because I remember that insulin index study years ago, and it left you wanting more, and then more didn't come for many, many years after that. And when it did come, it was sort of still an incomplete list, and it left you wondering, how can we use this, and why isn't this getting more play in the diabetes community, because it's such an important concept. So if we could back up a little bit, just for the people who maybe don't quite understand the connection between looking at the insulin responsive foods, why that's important for somebody with not only type 1 or type 2 diabetes, but somebody who has prediabetes, or even is just battling some overweight that could be related to metabolic health and insulin. So maybe just talk a little bit about what insulin does and sort of how that relates to our metabolic health and weight, and then diabetes.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating question, all in itself. So I suppose I've been looking at this a little bit more recently of what insulin actually does, and for a type 1 diabetic, they have to inject for food, and it's just a daily thing they have to live with. And when their blood sugars go high, they inject insulin to bring their blood sugars down, and when they eat carbohydrates, they inject insulin. But there's also a basal insulin that they take over all the day. So I was just preparing a blog post that I'm going to put out later today, that when we first started tracking it all, Moni was taking about 50 units of insulin a day, and about half of that was for her food and about half was basal. These days she's on about 25 units of insulin a day, but about 5 is for her food and about 20 is basal. So what the paradigm shift I'm sort of getting my head around is that usually we think of insulin as helping glucose and nutrients get into the cells, but at the same time, that would be a sort of an anabolic growth sort of hormone, but at the same time, it's also an anti-catabolic hormone, which means that basically ensures your body doesn't fall apart. So in type 1 diabetes, basically the body, because it's got no insulin, just allows all the energy in the fat and the protein and the glucose stores just to basically leach into the blood. They get really high glucose, ketones, and fatty acids, and end up disintegrating just about because they don't have this insulin. But it's really that basal insulin that holds the energy in the system to make sure your body doesn't fall apart, which is a good thing, because we want to build our muscles and we don't want our brains to disintegrate. But a lot of us who are a little bit bigger than we want to be, don't like insulin because it holds too much fat in. So that's the paradigm. And I suppose that's the thing I'm coming to understand, that the insulin index does a really nice job of predicting the short-term insulin response to our food, that the insulin index measured the area under the curve response to insulin to various foods over about 3 hours. But then you've also got to consider that basal insulin that holds energy in our body, and it's that, you're inferring before weight, etc. If we're able to manage the short-term response to insulin, we're able to stabilize our blood sugars, which is really good, and it helps us with appetite and stabilizing that. If our blood sugars are going up and down all the time, we're driven to eat because our blood sugars drop and we want food. But then at the same time, you've really got to look at the total energy value of our food, because that's what really drives the basal insulin, which keeps us a little bit bigger than we want to be a lot of the time. So in the end, I'm realizing it's about calories in the big picture, but in the short term, it really helps to manage that short term response to insulin. So that's the short story, and definitely a fascinating topic.
Yeah, it can be confusing for a lot of people.
Hopefully I haven't confused too much there. But
people just want to know, what to do, and is insulin good or bad? And of course, it's not an easy answer.
It's
right?
both.
Insulin is both, exactly. So we need it for sure.
Yeah.
And anybody with type 1 knows that very clearly.
Totally.
Because you're right. It's without it, our body just disintegrates, and insulin suppresses, basically the breakdown of our stores, so that we don't break down, and we need that. But at the same time, when we're resistant to insulin, it can be a problem. That's what
Totally.
type 2 diabetes is. And then when we have high insulin levels, of course, that all those anabolic effects kick in. So we get the growth of new fat cells, and we just start becoming, as you said, bigger than we want to be. And I know you've I don't know if you ever met with Dr. Kraft, but I know you've looked at his book and studied some of his work and watched maybe a video or two with him. And
fascinating area.
And he really talked about some of the damaging effects of elevated insulin levels, which I think is eye-opening, because a lot of people look at inflammation, cardiovascular, and kidney problems as just all about this high blood sugar. But as he sort of brought some light on high insulin, hyperinsulinemia can be problematic also.
Yeah, totally. I suppose on that, and that's another thing I'm digging into, is the personal fat threshold. I don't know whether you've...
can you talk about what that is? I saw that in one of your articles. It's from Roy Taylor, right?
Yeah, correct. Roy Taylor did some really fascinating work, and people will often go, well, why are some people who are still skinny quite fat, that they get diabetes, but some people can get quite fat before they get diabetes. It seems that there's this personal fat threshold, and from an evolutionary perspective, if you're a Maori or an Indian or an Australian Aborigine or something that needed to go a long time without food, go across a long voyage, to be able to store fat was probably a real advantage to survive. And so to be able to build up your fat stores really easily was a good thing. So that's sort of insulin sensitivity, in a way that your adipose tissue, your body fat stores, are able to store all this energy and get quite big before the adipose stores say, no more, I can't hold anymore. And that's the personal fat threshold. And at that point, all that excess energy starts to flow into your bloodstream as diabetes that we see, and then around our visceral, around our organs, our abdominal fat, and our liver and kidney and brain and heart all get fatty, and it's basically the genesis of all Western disease. But at the same time, you can get some people who are still quite lean who get to that personal fat threshold that just happens for them to be a much lower level of body fat. So I suppose that's where to think of insulin as that it's the anti-catabolic, it's the brake, it's the dam that holds back your fat stores. And once your energy in your body fills to a point where you get to that personal fat threshold, all that excess energy then flows out into your bloodstream and the places where you don't want it to be. So rather than just thinking, I'm getting insulin resistant because I've got too much insulin, it's really, I'm getting insulin resistant because my fat stores can't hold anymore. I've reached my personal fat threshold and exceeded that. And then, as you talk about, the way to actually reverse that is to start to release some of your fat out of fat stores. And as Taylor showed, at that point, you get a reversal of insulin resistance very, very, very quickly, even with only a little bit of weight loss. But it's that reversal of that pressure on your fat stores that helps you to reverse diabetes very, very quickly.
Yeah, and not so much the subcutaneous fat, but that visceral fat, the organ fat, right? That's what Dr. Taylor talks about with those MRI studies.
Definitely.
Burning that fat packed around the liver and pancreas. And that's so that's the trick, it's how do we get the body to burn that fat? Because I think there's pretty clear agreement that fat packed around the organs is going to make us insulin resistant. Maybe that might not be the original cause or genesis of all insulin resistance, the things that drive inflammation and so forth. But certainly once we get that fat around those organs, we're on our way to diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So if we can so if we can find out how to burn that fat, I think, as you said, it can really help people reverse that. So in your experience and research, how can people do that? What's the best way to get in and get rid of some of that fat?
And that's the fascinating question. And I suppose social media is such a fascinating online laboratory where you see so many opinions, and this thing works for me and this thing works for me, and carnivore and plant-based, and their antithesis. A lot of them, it's like, well, both of you groups are 10,000 members and very much the same level of passion and zeal and conviction that this solution worked for me. Yeah, so that leaves me as an engineer going, what are the common denominators? What are the common factors there? And what I do see is that, like I said before, once you stabilize your blood sugars with that lower insulin load, which is largely just reducing refined carbohydrates, people are able to get control of their appetite again. They're able to control their energy intake, and they suddenly go, oh, I'm magically losing weight. But, you know, that they've removed hyperpalatable foods. They might be eating a bit more protein, et cetera, et cetera. So that often works really well for people. But then at the same time, if they then go, well, I can hack this and I can throw a lot of extra refined fat in, I can do my fat bombs, my bulletproof coffee or whatever, and dietary fat, is a free food pretty much. That doesn't always end up leading them to optimal weight in the long term. So I suppose what I see there is that once you've stabilized your blood sugars, then you need to start focusing rather than on more fat and less carbs. It's like, how can I improve my food quality? How can I improve my nutrient density? And that's the next phase of my little systematized approach to say, well, what is nutrient density? What is good nutrition? How can we all quantify that in a way we agree? And that's
let me ask you just a quick question before we go there, because I do want to talk about that. But so I think what I just heard you say is that different eating approaches can work for different people, but it seems like sort of the bottom line, the golden thread, is that you need to find a way to eat that's satisfying, that makes you feel, because, and again, this will lead into nutrient density in foods, but makes us feel like we feel satisfied with less food, or at least less calories, if you will, or energy coming in, so that we can get into somewhat of a negative energy, negative caloric state, where we're actually able to burn more energy than we're consuming. And of course, there's a lot of people out there who are very passionate in whatever dietary philosophy they're following, which will make the statement that calories really don't matter. As long as you eat the right foods, you can eat as much as you want. I happen to disagree with that for people with diabetes and weight problems. Yeah. But is that kind of what you're saying? Is that at some point, no matter which eating strategy we follow, at some point we've got to be consuming less than we're burning from an energy state, so that we can burn the fat that's stored in our organs?
Yeah. The simple answer is yes, but then the more complex issue is, what drives appetite? Because appetite always wins, no matter how much I track on my phone, no matter how much I go, well, I'm going to weigh all my food. Eventually it's just goes, I'm just so hungry, I need to eat. And, you might fast for 3 days, but then all of a sudden you find yourself with the cream and the peanut butter and a tablespoon in the corner by yourself, just going, I'm so hungry, I deserve this. And,
so that's where, if somebody tried to eat 1,500 calories of soda and exist on that, it would be impossible, because their appetite would drive them to eat more. You just couldn't do it.
Exactly. Whether it's your blood sugar swings that are out of control, the lack of nutrients that drives your body to crave those nutrients, or whatever it is, or just foods are more filling, they're more nutritious, you're eating them in a more social context rather than in front of the computer and the car or whatever. The ultimate question is, how do you hack your appetite to the point that you do naturally eat less? And I think a lot of people, when they transition to that low carbohydrate approach, they remove the refined carbohydrates, and their blood sugars are more stable, and they're able to decrease their insulin a bit, and they are naturally more satiated, so they magically lose weight. But I think those people that say, well, I can eat 5,000 calories a day forever, maybe that works for some people who are healthy. They increase their non-exercise activity thermogenesis, they move more, they fidget more, they bounce around more. And then my son, when he has a lot of food, he's like fidgeting and jumping around, and you can't keep him still until he burns off that excess energy. But I think if you're starting to become insulin resistant, or if you keep on pounding the excess energy because it's yummy, or you believe it's healthy, or you're chasing optimal ketones of 3.0, then all of a sudden you're eating 5,000 or 6,000 calories and your body can't continue to burn off that excess energy, and you're going to hit your fat threshold. You're going to become insulin resistant. Your mitochondria are going to go, I can't do this anymore, and you're probably going to pack on the pounds. But if you go the other way, you might, people say, well, my metabolism will slow down, and it does, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we want energy efficient cars. We don't want to drive the big smoke blowing, fume producing, environmentally polluting cars these days. But somehow we think, I want to be able to eat as much as I can, and that's my goal. And it's like, well, how is that a solution for longevity and health? It's really, how can I make my body more efficient? And in time, you might actually need less energy, because once you burn fat more efficiently, it seems that rather than being a metabolic advantage, it seems a lot of people are finding that there's sort of a metabolic disadvantage, in that you become even more efficient and that you need even less calories when you've got a low carb, high fat diet, and you're satisfied, you're satiated with even less calories than you would have been before to maintain weight.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's interesting, right? And that's why, again, this can be so confusing for so many people. So the new question then becomes, what's the best diet, or how can we eat in such a way that we feel satisfied with less food, and we're really nourishing our bodies well? And I guess that's where nutrient density comes in.
I mean, Peter Attia, who you're probably aware of, talks about, he tries to keep his blood sugars low and stable with a fairly low standard deviation. Whereas a Dexcom, I don't think everybody needs to go to that level. But if you've got diabetes, you're probably tracking your blood sugars, and you've got a feel for how your blood sugars perform with different foods. But I think that's probably really good advice, is choose the foods that will keep your blood sugars down and fairly stable. But to really reduce your blood sugars, I think you need to get within that personal fat threshold. You need to reduce your body fat to a point where the fat is flowing out. You're at more of an optimal body fat level and waist to height ratio. But back to the question of what is it that helps you be more satiated with nutrition, and that's where I've tried to quantify things to say, okay, a lot of the time it's quite easy to get plenty of protein. As much as people argue about protein, if you're eating a nutrient-dense diet that has vitamin D and choline and magnesium and potassium and calcium, then you're going to be getting plenty of protein. And that's where focusing on those harder to find nutrients is the focus, and that's the impetus of the nutrient optimizer that I've designed to take your current diet, analyze it, and say what nutrients, what micronutrients aren't you getting enough of, and therefore what foods will actually fill those micronutrient gaps to boost your nutrition overall. And in the end, that ends up being a fairly balanced diet from a macronutrient point of view, and then you can refine it from there by reducing the insulin load a little bit if you're still struggling with your blood sugars or even your energy density. If you want to eat less, you can reduce your energy density so it's harder to get more food in, or you can increase your energy density if you're running a marathon or a triathlete or something, and you need to get more food in. Most of us probably are on the other end of the scale, but there's definitely other people who are athletes who need to get more energy dense food in. So all those things are quantifiable and systematizable, which is a fascinating rabbit hole.
Yeah, so if we're focusing on nutrient density, that's going to be a lot of fibrous vegetables. Obviously, it's going to be spices, and then some good quality animal proteins like seafood, fish, and different types of meat.
Definitely.
So it sounds to me like that's probably not a high fat diet. Is that what you think? As a high fat diet would be more energy dense, I guess.
Yeah, correct. So refined fats in and of themselves don't have a lot of vitamins and minerals. We can get our essential essential fatty acids with only quite in terms of grams of calories, only quite a small energy intake. So, but at the same time, I'm not saying everybody should strive for a 10% fat diet, because that's not necessarily filling. You won't be able to get the energy, and you've gone too far in that direction. So you just need to find that balance point, but continually pushing for high fat and high ketones in the belief that that will lead to weight loss for everyone doesn't seem to work overall from what I've seen.
And nuts and seeds, you would say, are probably, even though they do have nutrients and fiber, are probably still more energy dense than nutrient dense, or are they kind of somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, if your goal is weight loss, then probably minimizing the dairy and the nuts and seeds is probably a good idea, and focusing, like you said, on the less fattier meats and the veggies. And at that point, you just get really full really quickly. You get all the nutrients you need. And it's really hard to overeat those foods. You don't sit in the corner and binge on spinach, kale, and liver. So,
right.
And not that you all need to be to that extreme, but you can see that, it's much easier to binge on the peanut butter or the cream or the McDonald's or whatever it is. So ultimately, the fat and the carbs with very low protein together, it seems to be the ultimate obesogenic solution there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then fruit, again, because of the high amount of sugar and fructose, I would imagine is probably more, even though, again, you've got phytonutrients and some vitamins and so forth, it's probably still more energy dense than nutrient dense.
For sure. For my wife, who's type 1 diabetic, she doesn't, when she goes into a low, she might go, I finally get to eat a banana or a mandarin or something and enjoy the fruit that she sort of craves a little bit. But most of the time that'll shoot her blood sugars all over the place. And if, like you say, if you're trying to lose weight, that may not be the ultimate solution. But at the same time, there's a lot of people out there who, there's a whole plant-based, vegan, whole foods diabetes area that seem to do fairly well, but I think that's just because if you're eating fruit and vegetables, it's really hard to overeat. You just can't get enough calories in. So if you just narrow it down to only those foods, then you're going to be in a calorie deficit, which is going to reverse your diabetes. So
right, and eating very, very low fat typically, so they're still going to end up burning some fat, even though their insulin levels may end up a little bit higher.
Sure. They also, and the blood sugars will be shot. So if you look at their blood sugars and HbA1c compared to the people from type 1 grit who follow a Bernstein higher protein, moderate fat, low carb type approach, their blood sugars and HbA1cs are, there's no competition. It's just night and day.
Yeah, and they're usually injecting more insulin as well, the type 1s, even though they're injecting a lot less insulin per gram of carbohydrates. So they oftentimes describe their insulin sensitivity is very good, but it's all relative. They're still injecting usually a lot more insulin. Yeah,
totally. I did a post where I looked at the maths of what they're doing there. I'm not fully on board with the way they say, look, I'm more, because I can eat 200 grams of carbs and I don't need as much insulin, I'm more insulin sensitive. But at the same time, like you said, the HbA1cs are through the roof and their blood sugars are like this. And I can't imagine that's a great way to live as a type 1. Yeah,
I think it'd be difficult. Very interesting. So you've got some great tools on your website. And I'd love for you to talk about some of them. I'll mention a few, and then maybe you can elaborate on them. But you talked about nutrient density, which I think is something people want to look at. I think this whole idea of insulin response is really important. And you've sort of, in a roundabout way, solved this problem of having a limited menu of foods to understand the insulin response. So from the research, because you created a formula that kind of estimates insulin response. So maybe you can talk just a few minutes about that. And then you've got some other great tools on there too that I'd love for you to mention. I've got a blog, Optimizing Nutrition, which is just, thinking out loud. And I started sharing about the insulin index and people enjoyed it. And I made a lot of friends and I continued to just go down the rabbit hole. So that a lot of that is quite detailed and intense and probably aimed at
people like yourself and people who are really enthusiastic enthusiasts to learn more about it.
For somebody like me, it's very exciting. So your posts, you put a lot of time and effort into your posts. I mean, they're really fantastic. Yeah, and by the way,
Thank you.
For people in the States like me, it's optimizing with an S, so it's optimizing nutrition.com.
Yep.
So
yeah.
make
So,
sure you,
so from
make sure
that,
you put that S in there.
taking the insulin load and nutrient density, I put those together and create a bunch of food lists so people can download an A4 sheet and stick it to the fridge and take it shopping and say, well, what do I eat? And then I took the same sort of approach to meals, so you can rank your meals based on your goals, whether it be weight loss or managing your diabetes, and then I suppose then there's other factors of your gut and how good your gut is, and your autoimmune, and I'm allergic to this, that, and the other. So then there's a whole bunch of lists for that, and testosterone and hypothyroid and high cholesterol, and you can, by looking at the nutrients that you need to target or need to avoid, or the foods you need to avoid, you can create all these lists. And it basically got out of control, and I went, oh, maybe there's a way to automate this. And I had a vision, had an idea, and then a friend, Alex Zotov from Atlanta, got involved, and that was about 6 months ago. And just now we're starting to get that online to the point where you can log your food, you can upload your food log, you can say, these are my goals, I've got insulin resistance, or I've got diabetes, or my blood sugars are stable, now I want to lose weight, and it'll tell you what foods you need to eat more of that you're currently eating, and what foods you need to eat less of, and here's a bunch of foods and recipes that you should try. And I just think that's the ultimate tool that will conquer nutrition, because I think I suppose I designed it to be the ultimate solution, because, as we said, there's so much disagreement, whether it's carnivore or vegan or whatever. I think it comes down to, are you getting the nutrients you need without too much energy? So that's the Nutrient Optimizer, which is nutrientoptimizer.com. So you can go there and just get basically a macro guidance. So for people who are fairly healthy, those macro ranges can be quite large. But for people who might be looking for therapeutic ketosis, that starts to get quite tight with lower protein and really low carbohydrates, and diabetes is moderate protein and lower carbohydrates. So that'll start you on the road with your macronutrients. And then there's a full report that you can pay for, where you can upload all your chronometer data from your food log, and it'll give you that feedback. And in about a month, we're coming out with a dashboard where you can continue to track yourself through it. So it'll be basically a dietitian or a diabetologist in a box that'll give you that guidance and a systematized approach that'll say, well, my blood sugars are this, how do I tweak things? Or I'm gaining weight, how do I tweak it? Or I'm not losing enough weight, or I'm losing too much weight, how do I tweak my energy intake? And what meals do I need to eat to actually get to that? So I'm totally thrilled to talk to you about that, and to be able to get the word out about that. And it's still just getting off the ground, but as the ball starts rolling, hopefully more and more people catch on. It'll conquer the world.
I highly recommend it, because a lot of people are frustrated and they need a little bit more guidance on exactly what foods to focus on, and which ones to maybe move away from for a while.
Definitely.
And the logic behind what you're doing is, I think, seamless. It makes total sense. So that's great.
Yeah, I think if we just put it out there and say, these are the rules, these are the fundamental principles of nutrition. We want nutrients without too much energy. We want to control our blood sugars. Does everybody agree with that? It's like, yep, nobody disagrees with that, really. And here's the system to actually achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very good. So Marty, I definitely encourage people to go check out your websites, optimizingnutrition.com and nutrientoptimizer.com for sure. As we're getting close to wrapping up here, there's a few questions I love to ask all my guests. And the first one I'll ask you in regards to the work that we're talking about today, this passion project that you're doing. And if you had a statement or a quote or a concept that could kind of summarize your legacy in this area, something that summarized the work and represented your work, what would you say?
Yeah, I think in 30 or 50 years' time, I'd love to look back and see that all those ideas that I've put into the nutrient optimizer, when at the moment there's so much confusion about nutrition, that brings a lot of clarity and success for people, and that a lot of people have been really helped. And that's what really drives me to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and chat to people like yourself in the States, and continue to write those articles and try to get it straight in my head and to try and explain it to other people. So yeah, I really hope that in the fullness of time that this will be a really valuable tool to solve a lot of the confusion that obviously people need personally and economically, because diabetes is bankrupting the Western economy basically. So
Yeah, very, very true. That's amazing.
hmm.
If you had a friend or a family member, and you do have a very close family member with type 1 diabetes, if you had someone who was newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes,
Yep.
and they came to you and asked you for some advice, and in just a couple of minutes, what would you tell them to do?
I suppose it's eliminate or reduce processed food and try to fill your diet with real whole food, and probably track your blood sugars and titrate down your carbohydrates to the point that you get stable blood sugars and you feel good. But don't avoid whole protein, don't avoid whole foods. Don't go, oh, this lettuce has got 2 carbohydrates in it, so I'm going to flip out, I can't eat that. Yeah.
Do you think people with type 2 diabetes who are clearly insulin resistant need to try to cut down on foods that have a high insulin response? Do you think part of improving insulin sensitivity and burning that fat is keeping our blood insulin levels down low or lower?
Yeah, I suppose it's the short-term insulin response versus the long-term insulin response, and just cutting back on the processed carbohydrates is generally what will help you to stabilize your blood sugars. I think I think the insulin index and the thinking about insulin can go wrong is that we end up also avoiding protein, which I think is probably only relevant if you're managing epilepsy or dementia or those sort of things that need a therapeutic ketogenic diet. For people who just have type 2 diabetes, arguably they may need more protein because the protein is they've got excess gluconeogenesis, and the protein is being converted to sugar rather than being built into their muscles because of the reduced insulin sensitivity. So arguably they actually need more protein, and that'll also help with satiety and nutrient density. And if there's one thing that correlates with nutrient density, it's protein. And if you try to avoid protein, you end up avoiding all the vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids that are also important. So I don't really care about high protein, but I know if you avoid protein, then your nutrient density is going to fall through the floor.
Wow, that's great advice.
Mm.
My last question for you today is, if you found yourself in a room sitting around a table with 20 world leaders, the presidents and prime ministers of the most industrialized developed countries in the world, and they brought you in because they are trying to solve the diabetes epidemic, the world diabetes epidemic, and they asked you what they should do. What advice would you give them?
I think to take away the commercial conflicts of interest, because I think that really dominates our current food environment, cost and advertising and things that will continue to drive appetite, fake flavors, fake colors, and like anything that's got those things in them, you need to get rid of that. So I think you need to find a way to remove that. And I suppose the way to do that is to look at agreeing on the fundamental principles of nutrition, which I think end up being, does it contain the nutrients you need without excess calories? And, given the diabetes epidemic is exploding, does it manage your blood sugars? And then if you wanted to extend on that, you've got, calorie focusing on the total calories in your diet to titrate that down, and other autoimmune sensitivities and gut issues. So I think to look at those as fundamental principles and agree on those principles and say, how can we apply that in our community and educate people? And I agree that all those things get complex when you try to think of them as individual moving parts, but I think to continue to develop systems and systematize nutrition based on those fundamental principles that everybody can agree on would be an exciting step forward for the international population.
I couldn't agree more. Marty Kendall, thank you so much for spending time and for being part of the Mastering Blood Sugar podcast, for getting up early here for me today also.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for the opportunity. Cheers, mate.
I see the sun rising in the background there, as we talked about might happen. So. All right. Again, thanks a lot. And thank all of you for being part of the Mastering Blood Sugar podcast. I'll be back next week with another expert interview.